On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Pacific sky still belonged to the United States Navy. Or so most American sailors believed as they drank coffee on the decks of Battleship Row. Minutes later, the first wave of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros appeared out of the rising sun like silver hornets, and everything changed forever. The sound that followed was not the heroic roar Americans expected from aerial combat. It was the thin, tearing whine of Nakajima Sakai engines diving at full throttle, followed by the sharp, deliberate cough of 20mm cannons chewing through steel and flesh with surgical indifference. When the smoke cleared that afternoon, the battleships were broken, the harbor burned, and every pilot in the Pacific Fleet understood one simple truth. The Zero was not just another fighter plane. It was a predator that had evolved specifically to kill everything wearing an American roundel. For the next 2 years, the name Zero became the shortest, most effective horror story in the United States Navy. Flight leaders did not need to describe the aircraft in briefings. They only had to say the word, and every man in the room felt his stomach drop. The Mitsubishi A6M weighed barely 5,600 pounds fully loaded, less than a modern pickup truck. Yet it could outclimb, outturn, and outrun anything the Allies put in the air in 1942. Its wings were so long and light that it could loop and roll as if the laws of physics had been negotiated down to a gentleman's agreement. American pilots learned very quickly that trying to dogfight a Zero, the way Hollywood had taught them, was a short conversation with death. In ready rooms from Pearl Harbor to Noumea, intelligence officers pinned up cold statistics that read like execution notices. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese carrier air groups shot down 23 American aircraft for the loss of only 3 Zeros. At Midway, the following month, Zero's flying combat air patrol slaughtered the slow Devastator torpedo bombers long before they ever reached dropping range. In the long, brutal campaign for Guadalcanal, Marine and Navy squadrons flying the stout little Grumman F6F Wildcat learned that the only way to survive a determined Zero pilot was to refuse to play his game. Captain John Thok invented the Thok Weave, 4 Wildcats flying in pairs that crossed in front of each other so that any attacking Zero instantly found itself inside the cone of 4 sets of 50 caliber guns. It worked sometimes, but it was a tactic born of desperation, not confidence. Even when the weave held, American pilots still bled altitude, bled fuel, and bled friends. On the rain-soaked flight line of Henderson Field in the Solomon Islands, 19- and 20-year-old Marines sat on ammunition crates and read the latest intelligence summaries by the light of kerosene lanterns. One pilot, a former high school quarterback from Ohio, read aloud in a voice that kept trying to break. Enemy fighter turned inside Lieutenant Hayes at the top of a loop, fired 1 short burst from dead astern. Lieutenant Hayes never transmitted again. The only answer was the endless drumming of tropical rain on corrugated tin and the distant, mocking whine of Japanese reconnaissance planes circling far overhead, untouchable. No one spoke after that. They simply stared at the mud between their boots and tried to imagine how they would fight an enemy that could climb above them, turn inside them, and still have fuel left to chase them all the way back to the carrier. The fear was not abstract. It was physical, measurable, and merciless. Squadron flight surgeons recorded resting heart rates of 140 beats per minute the night before a strike. Men lost 15 pounds in a month because their stomachs closed like fists at the thought of another hop. Some pilots taped their trembling fingers to the throttle quadrant so the stick would not shake when the Zeros came. One Enterprise squadron commander quietly removed 3 pilots from the flight schedule after they threw up in their oxygen masks during routine carrier qualifications. They were not cowards. They were simply human beings who had looked into the future and seen a sky that wanted them dead. Across the ocean, in the wooden paper ready rooms of the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Zuikaku, and Shokaku, the mood was entirely different. Pilots trained for 3 years before they ever saw combat. They flew every day, in every kind of weather, until the aircraft became an extension of heartbeat and breath. Men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto were not merely aces. They were national legends while the war was still young. Sakai once shot down 4 American fighters in a single engagement. then flew 600 miles home with one eye shot out and blood filling his cockpit. When Japanese pilots gathered in the evening, they drank sake and laughed about how slowly the Americans turned, how predictably they broke, how easy it was to line up behind a Wildcat and watch it burn. In Tokyo, schoolchildren drew crayon pictures of graceful Zeros circling clumsy, fat American aircraft that fell like stones. The mythology was complete and unbreakable. The Zero rained because its pilots believed it rained, and every parachute drifting down over the Coral Sea was proof. But myths are fragile when they meet reality hard enough. On June 4, 1942, while the great carrier battle at Midway raged far to the south, a young Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga lifted off from the flight deck of the carrier Ryujo on a routine strike against Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. Koga was 22 years old and flying his first combat mission. He was nervous, proud, and already marked for death. During the attack, a single American anti-aircraft bullet sliced through an oil return line on his Zero. The engine temperature climbed like a fever. Koga knew he could never make it back to the carrier. His briefing officer had told him about a grassy meadow on remote Akutan Island where an emergency wheels-down landing might be possible. He turned east, fighting a stiffening rudder as the engine seized solid. The landing was almost perfect. The Zero touched down at 90 knots, rolled across the grass, and then nosed over into soft tundra. The canopy shattered. Koga's neck broke instantly. His fighter lay inverted in the marsh, wheels still spinning lazily in the cold wind, the red rising sun insignias on the wings bright against the green. For 5 weeks, Alaskan storms hid the wreck from American patrols. Then, on July 10th, a Navy PBY Catalina, flying a routine search, spotted the unmistakable meatballs. Sailors in parkas stared at the intact Zero as if it were a dragon dragged from a cave. They expected a monster. What they found was a revelation. When the aircraft was finally disassembled, crated, and shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, American engineers discovered just how much of the Zero's magic had been purchased with vulnerability. There was no armor plate behind the pilot's seat. The fuel tanks were naked aluminum, one tracer round, and they became bombs. The lightweight airframe that allowed those impossible turns crumpled under anything heavier than a harsh glance. A cautious 3-second burst from 6 Browning 50 calibers would tear a Zero into burning confetti. The monster was made of paper. In a quiet hangar at Bethpage, Long Island, the Grumman design team tore up an elegant line they had ever drawn for a fighter aircraft. They had seen the future, and the future was not graceful. The future was angry, armored, and absolutely certain of its own survival. Far across the Pacific, in the carrier ready rooms the Japanese still called the land of the gods, young pilots were still laughing about how easily the Americans died. They would not laugh for much longer. But far away, in a lonely Alaskan marsh, a silent Zero lay belly up in the grass, holding a secret that would soon flip the fear of the Pacific sky back onto the men who had created it. The repaired Akutan Zero touched down at North Island, San Diego, on September 20th, 1942, and the Pacific War quietly pivoted on that single landing. Navy test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders eased the fighter onto the mat, rolled to a stop, and sat motionless for a long moment while the propeller ticked itself cool. When he finally climbed down the wing route, his face was pale beneath the sunburn. A cluster of engineers and intelligence officers waited in silence. Sanders pulled off his goggles, looked at the men who had spent months dying beneath this very airplane, and spoke the sentence that rewrote every blueprint in America. "Gentlemen, it's a flying eggshell with a lot of horsepower. Treat it rough, and it dies." Within 48 hours, the Zero was stripped naked in a guarded hangar. Armorers removed the cowling and stared at an engine held together by hope and baling wire. Fuel system experts discovered that the tanks had no sealant at all. A single incandescent tracer would turn the entire wing into a blowtorch. Structural engineers pressed their thumbs into the duralumin skin and left dents. One lieutenant actually punched through a wing panel with his fist. The laughter that followed was thin and nervous because every man in the room understood the same thing. Everything they had lost in 1942 had been lost to a fighter that could be killed with contempt if you built the right weapon. 2,000 miles east, at Grumman's Bethpage plant on Long Island, chief designer Leroy Grumman slammed a thick fist onto a drafting table hard enough to crack the glass top. "No more dancing with these bastards," he growled. "We're building a goddamn battering ram with wings." The new fighter already had a project number, G50, but the men in the shop started calling it something else. They called it the Zero Killer. And then, when the first mock-up appeared, someone scrawled across the wooden fuselage in grease pencil, Hellcat. The name stuck the way blood sticks to a bayonet. The philosophy was brutally simple. Where the Zero had sacrificed everything for lightness, the Hellcat would sacrifice nothing for survivability. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp would deliver 2,000 horsepower, 400 more than the Zero's Sakai, and it would be wrapped in armor plate thick enough to stop a 20mm round cold. The pilot would sit inside a steel bathtub. The fuel tanks would seal themselves even after multiple hits. The windshield would be bulletproof glass an 1.5 inches thick. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns would fire at a combined rate of 5,000 rounds per minute, and the wings would carry them plus bombs plus drop tanks, plus the stubborn conviction that no Japanese pilot would ever dictate the terms of combat again. In the wind tunnel and on the test stand, the Hellcat grew ugly the way a heavyweight boxer grows ugly. Scarred, thick-necked, and impossible to put on the canvas. Engineers who once argued about drag coefficients now argued about how many hits the airframe could absorb before anyone inside even noticed. One test pilot deliberately flew the prototype into a hail of simulated 20mm fire over Long Island Sound and landed with half the rudder shot away, grinning like a man who had just discovered immortality. While American factories began to hum with righteous anger, the first whispers of doubt drifted eastward, across the Pacific, on the lips of men who had never known doubt before. In the officers' mess on the carrier Zuikaku, a veteran flight leader named Masatake Okumiya listened to a returning reconnaissance pilot describe a new American fighter spotted near Espiritu Santo. "It's big," the pilot said, sketching on a napkin. "Bigger than a Wildcat. Blunt nose, thick wings. It didn't try to turn with us, it just kept coming." Okumiya frowned into his tea. He had fought Americans for a year and had never seen one that refused to turn away. By early 1943, the rumors had names. Intelligence officers in Rabaul read intercepted American radio chatter and underlined one word over and over, Hellcat. No one knew what it looked like yet, but the name itself carried weight like a gauntlet thrown down in a duel. Young pilots laughed at first. Americans always gave their aircraft childish names. But the older men, the ones who had flown since China in 1937, felt something cold settle in their chests. Saburo Sakai, on leave in Japan after losing an eye over Guadalcanal, heard the rumors from fresh cadets and told them bluntly, "If the Americans have finally learned what we already know about their Wildcats, they will build something we cannot outturn. Pray it is slow." It was not slow. On June 30, 1943, the first operational F6F Hellcats landed aboard USS Independence at Pearl Harbor. The deck crews stared at the new fighters the way peasants once stared at armored knights riding out of the mist. The Hellcats were midnight blue, slab-sided, and looked twice as heavy as the graceful Zeros they were designed to kill. When the R2800s fired up, the entire flight deck trembled with a bass growl that made the old Wildcats sound like sewing machines. Pilots who had spent a year being prey now strapped into cockpits that smelled of fresh paint and vengeance. Their briefing was one sentence long, delivered by Captain Jimmy Flatley of VF5. "Forget everything you ever learned about running from Zeros. From now on, we are the ones who do not turn away." Training intensified to a brutal pace. At Daytona Beach and Melbourne, Florida, new pilots flew 8 hours a day against captured or simulated Zeros. Instructors hammered home the new gospel. Never turn with a Zero below 300 knots, never sacrifice altitude for position, never give the Japanese pilot the fight he wants. The Hellcat climbs almost as well as a Zero when it's clean, dives like a safe dropped off a roof, and can absorb punishment that would tear any Japanese aircraft into confetti. Hit hard, hit first, and never, ever be afraid. In mock combat, the results were obscene. A single Hellcat flown by an average pilot routinely destroyed 3 or 4 A6M replicas before the exercise ended. The instructors began to worry they were creating monsters. One day, a young ensign named David McCampbell, quiet, methodical, already marked for greatness, flew against 4 instructors simulating seasoned Japanese aces. When the flag dropped, McCampbell disappeared into a cloud, came out above and behind the entire formation, and shot down all 4 in 45 seconds. The debriefing room was silent. Then someone started clapping, and no one knew whether to cheer or pray. Far away, in the Empire, the Japanese still believed invincible. The whispers grew darker. A transport pilot returning from Truk told of American carriers launching strange new fighters that flew in loose, confident pairs instead of the old defensive weaves. A reconnaissance photograph taken over the Solomons showed a burning Zero spiraling into the sea with a thick-winged, blunt-nosed predator glued to its tail. Japanese intelligence officers stared at the grainy print for a long time. One of them finally spoke the thought every man in the room shared. They have built an aircraft that does not fear us. In the barracks at Rabaul, veterans who once toasted victories with sake now drank in silence. New pilots arriving from Japan, boys with barely 100 hours in their logbooks, asked eager questions about dogfighting Americans. The veterans no longer laughed. They only stared out at the humid night and answered with a single sentence that carried more weight than any tactical briefing. Wait until you meet the big blue one. By the autumn of 1943, the Pacific sky had 2 predators circling each other, waiting for the first real clash. One was still elegant, lethal, and fragile. The other was new, angry, and absolutely certain it could not be killed. The Americans had built an aircraft that didn't fear the Zero, and soon, neither would its pilots. November 1st, 1943, dawn over Wake Island. The air is glassy calm, the kind of morning that makes the Pacific look like polished steel. From the deck of the Japanese transport convoy, the rising sun turns the horizon blood red, and every man aboard knows this is the last sunrise many of them will ever see. Escorting the convoy are 34 fighters from the 252nd Kokutai, led by one of the finest pilots still alive in the Imperial Navy, Lieutenant Commander Toshiuki Sueda, 29 years old, 31 kills, a veteran of China, the Philippines, and the Solomons. Sueda is quiet, almost gentle on the ground, but in the air he is pure predator. He has never once broken off an attack because the enemy was too numerous or too determined. Today he believes he is hunting wildcats again. High above, circling at 22,000 feet, are 12 brand-new Grumman F6F Hellcats from VF6 aboard USS Enterprise. Their leader is a soft-spoken lieutenant from Illinois named Robert Duncan. He has flown wildcats for a year, has 2 confirmed kills, and has spent the last 6 weeks learning one lesson over and over in training. The Hellcat is not here to play fair. Duncan's headset crackles. Skipper. Radar shows bogies climbing through 15,000 bearing 260. Duncan thumbs the mic, calm as Sunday breakfast. Copy. Let's go to work. The 2 formations close at a combined speed of almost 600 knots. Sueda sees the Americans first. 12 dark shapes against the pale dawn, flying in loose fighting pairs instead of the old defensive weave. He smiles without humor. Americans are predictable. They will dive away the moment the Zeros turn into them. He rolls his section of 6 Zeros into a hard starboard break, wings flashing silver as they slice toward the Hellcats. The distance collapses. 3,000 yards, 2,000, 1,000, and the Americans do not dive away. Inside Sueda's cockpit, the sake engine whines its familiar high song. His oxygen mask fogs with every sharp breath. He centers the nearest Hellcat in his Revi gun sight, thumb hovering over the cannon button. The American fighter is huge, blunt-nosed, ugly. It fills the sight faster than any Wildcat ever has. Sueda squeezes. 2 20mm shells streak out, followed by a ribbon of 7.7mm tracers. He sees one hit spark along the Hellcat's wing root. The Hellcat does not explode. It does not smoke. It does not even flinch. Instead, the big blue fighter rolls inverted, pulls its nose straight down through the middle of Sueda's formation, and comes up behind his wingman in one impossible violent arc. 650 caliber muzzles flash like a strobe. Sueda's wingman, Petty Officer First Class Nakayama, simply disappears in a blossom of fire and aluminum. No parachute, no radio call. Just gone. Sueda's mouth goes dry. He snaps his Zero into a vertical climb, the only direction he has ever been safe. The Hellcat follows. Not as tightly. He can see that, but it follows with a kind of relentless certainty that feels obscene. The Hellcat's engine roars like a bear, where the Zero's sings like a bird. Sueda's airspeed bleeds off at the top of the climb. He kicks rudder, rolls over the top, and dives for his life. The Hellcat does not try to loop with him. It simply lowers its nose and accelerates. In seconds, the distance is closing again. Below, the rest of the fight has already turned into a massacre. The new American pilots are not geniuses. They are simply following the rules they drilled for months. Never turn below 300 knots. Never sacrifice energy. Hit hard, hit first, and never break off until the Zero is burning or fleeing. One Hellcat pilot, Ensign Killer Kane, latches onto a Zero that tries to dogfight him at low level. The Japanese pilot turns beautifully inside Kane's radius again and again, but every time he reverses, Kane refuses to follow. Instead, Kane climbs, rolls, and comes down again in a hammering dive. On the fourth pass, the Zero's wing folds like wet cardboard and it spirals into the lagoon. Sueda's headset is chaos. Young pilots scream. Veterans curse. Someone is praying aloud. He snaps orders, climb, climb for altitude, but the Hellcats are already above them, waiting like wolves on a ridge. He sees another Zero disintegrate, then another. In 4 minutes, he has lost 7 aircraft. 7. In the entire Solomon's campaign, he had never lost more than 2 in a single day. Robert Duncan finds Sueda at 18,000 feet. Duncan's Hellcat has taken 3 20mm hits, one in the engine cowling, one through the port aileron, one that shattered the radio behind the seat. None of them matter. The R-2800 still thunders, oil pressure steady, coolant temperature normal. Duncan rolls in behind the fleeing Zero, closest to 200 yards, and fires a measured 3-second burst. The Zero's fuselage erupts in flame. Sueda jinks violently, somehow keeps the aircraft flying, and dives for a cloud layer 1,000 feet below. Duncan does not follow. He simply watches the burning fighter disappear and feels something strange settle in his chest, not triumph, but recognition. The fear has changed sides. Sueda lands at Wake with 5 bullets left and fuel for 20 more minutes of flight. He climbs down from his cockpit on legs that will not stop shaking. Ground crew rush forward, expecting congratulations. Sueda ignores them. He walks straight to the operations hut, sits down, and stares at the wall for a long time. Finally, he speaks, so quietly the intelligence officer has to lean close to hear. They are not wildcats. They are something else. They do not turn away, they do not burn, and they climb almost as well as we do when they want to. He looks up, eyes hollow. Tell the new boys the Americans have a fighter that refuses to die. That night, the story spreads through every Japanese squadron within radio range. Pilots who have never seen a Hellcat repeat the details like a ghost story. Big blue fighters that take cannon shells the way a battleship takes rifle fire, that dive at 400 knots and pull out without shedding wings, that carry pilots who no longer sound afraid on the radio. In the barracks at Rabaul, Saburo Sakai listens to the tale from a shaken survivor and feels the old wound behind his blind eye throb. He says nothing, but that night he writes in his diary for the first time in months. The Americans have built a fighter that does not respect the Zero. This is worse than any defeat. 2 weeks later, on November 11th, Hellcats from USS Saratoga and USS Princeton tear apart a 50-plane Japanese strike over Rabaul. 31 Zeros and Vals are shot down in 20 minutes. Only 3 Hellcats are damaged, none lost. Japanese radio discipline collapses into screaming. Veterans who once lectured rookies about the sanctity of the offensive spirit now speak in hushed tones about the Big Blue Devils. New pilots arriving from Japan, boys with 90 hours total flight time, hear the stories and feel their stomachs knot. They had been told the Americans were cowards who ran at the first sign of a determined attack. No one is running anymore. In a quiet wardroom aboard Enterprise, Robert Duncan writes a letter home to his wife. He does not mention the 17 Japanese aircraft VF-6 claimed over Wake, or the fact that his own Hellcat came back with a 20mm hole you could stick a football through. He only writes one line she will remember for the rest of her life. Today, the sky felt different. For the first time, I wasn't the one who was afraid. Across the widening Pacific, seasoned Japanese aces gather after dusk and stare at the stars. They have flown together since 1937. They have never known fear as a formation, only as individuals who could be braver than the moment. Now, for the first time, they feel something unfamiliar creeping into the cockpit with them. Something cold and patient that waits behind every cloud. For the first time, Japanese aces felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. By the first light of 1944, the Pacific sky had become a slaughterhouse with no walls. Tarawa fell in November 1943, then Kwajalein in February, then Rabaul was hammered into a burning scrapyard that no Japanese pilot dared approach after sunset. Each victory was announced in Washington with crisp press releases and smiling photographs of admirals. In the ready rooms of the Japanese fleet, the same victories arrived as whispered casualty lists that grew longer every week. The names that disappeared were no longer just rookies. They were the men who had taught the rookies, the men who had once made the Americans bleed. In the officers' mess at Truk, a 26-year-old flight leader named Tominaga poured sake for pilots who would never drink it. He read the latest dispatch aloud, voice flat. 252nd Kokutai, 31 aircraft committed over Rabaul, 6 returned. The room was silent except for the distant thud of American bombs walking across the anchorage. No one toasted, no one even looked up. The Hellcat was no longer a rumor. It was a daily fact of death. Pilots who survived now spoke of the big blue fighters the way medieval peasants once spoke of the Black Plague, something that came without warning, struck without mercy, and left nothing behind but silence. The mathematics were merciless. In November 1943, the exchange rate had been roughly 3 zeros for every Hellcat lost. By March 1944, it was 12-1. By May, it was 20-1. Japanese squadrons were not being defeated. They were being exterminated. The training pipeline in Japan had already cracked the year before and was now collapsing entirely. Where once a naval aviator received 500 to 700 hours of flight time before his first combat cruise, the new boys now arrived with 90 hours total, sometimes less. Many had never fired their guns in anger. Some had never landed on a carrier deck, even in peacetime. They were brave the way children are brave, because they had no idea what waited for them. At Rabaul in April 1944, a 19-year-old petty officer named Hiroshi stood on the crushed coral runway clutching his flight logbook like a prayer scroll. He had flown exactly 4 hours in a zero before being shipped south. A veteran with a scarred face and one arm in a sling took him aside. "Listen carefully," the veteran said. "When the Hellcats come, do not turn with them. Do not climb with them. Do not try to be clever. You will see a big blue airplane with a white star. The moment you see it, push everything forward and run for home. If you turn, you die. If you climb, you die. If you hesitate, you die. Do you understand?" Hiroshi nodded, eyes wide. 3 days later, he was shot down over the St. George Channel by a Hellcat pilot who had never even seen him. The veterans themselves were disappearing faster than replacements could be printed on paper. Saburo Sakai, the one-eyed legend, was grounded in Japan with injuries that would never fully heal. Nishizawa, the Devil of Rabaul, was killed in October 1944 while riding as a passenger in a transport, shot down by a Hellcat whose pilot never knew he had just erased one of the greatest aces in history. One by one, the old gods fell, and there was no one left to teach the new boys how to survive. In the cockpit, the terror became intimate. Japanese pilots learned to recognize the low, predatory growl of the R-2800 long before they ever saw the airplane itself. They learned that a Hellcat could absorb an entire magazine of 20 millimeters and keep boring in. They learned that American pilots no longer broke off when ammunition ran low. They simply rammed if they had to. They learned that the radio chatter on the American tactical frequency was calm, almost bored, as if the speakers were reading grocery lists while they killed. A surviving fragment of a letter written by an unknown Zero pilot in May 1944 was later found floating in an oil drum. The Hellcat does not fight, it executes. It is not angry. It is patient. It waits above the clouds like a hawk and then falls on us the way winter falls on the village. We have no answer. I am sorry, Mother. At night, the fear followed them into their bunks. Men woke screaming from dreams of blue wings filling the windshield. Some refused to get out of bed for morning patrols. One squadron leader at truck shot himself in his quarters rather than lead another mission he knew would end in annihilation. No one blamed him. On the American carriers, the mood was almost the opposite, a hard, quiet confidence that felt like sunrise after years of storm. Hellcat pilots began to treat Japanese formations the way hunters treat driven game. They spoke of flushing zeros, the way sportsmen speak of flushing pheasant. David McCampbell, now commander of Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex, kept a small notebook in his cockpit. After each mission, he calmly wrote the time, the place, and the number of kills. The pages filled with neat, unemotional columns. By June 1944, the running total was already obscene. In ready rooms, American pilots no longer talked about surviving the war. They talked about ending it. They swapped stories the way Japanese pilots once had, but the punchlines were different now. Did you see that Zeke try to loop with me? I just followed him around until his wings came off. I put 3 hits in a Val's engine, and he still tried to bomb the fleet. Hellcat took it in the wing tank and sealed right up, landed with half a wing and a grin. The laughter was not cruel. It was simply the sound of men who had discovered they were no longer prey. Back in Japan, the High Command watched the reports with the slow, sick realization that the air itself had turned against them. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's former chief of staff, wrote in his diary after the Kwajalein disaster, "We are sending boys to fight armored knights with bamboo spears. The Hellcat has become a demon that haunts every cloud. Our pilots see it even when it is not there." Orders went out to conserve the remaining veterans at all costs, to use them only as instructors, but there were no longer enough veterans left to instruct anyone. The fleet carriers sailed with air groups that were 70 to 80% replacements. Some squadrons had an average age of 21 and an average life expectancy of 2 sorties. In the final weeks before the storm that would break everything, Japanese pilots began to do something they had never done before the Hellcat arrived. They began to break off attacks while they still had fuel and ammunition. They began to dive away when the odds were only 2 to 1. They began to look over their shoulders in clear sky. The fear had become policy. The fear had become doctrine. The fear had become the only honest thing left in the cockpit. What the Zero had once inspired in American hearts, cold, paralyzing dread, the Hellcat now returned to the Japanese, multiplied 100-fold, and sharpened to a killing edge. And the edge was moving west, inexorable as the sunrise, toward the Marianas, where the last illusions of the Imperial Japanese Navy were waiting to be shattered forever. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The greatest carrier battle of the war begins not with the thunder of guns, but with the low, collective growl of 400 Pratt & Whitney R-2800s warming up on 11 American flight decks. Task Force 58 is a moving fortress of steel and vengeance. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. Above them, 475 Hellcats orbit like dark blue hornets, stacked in layers from 5,000 to 25,000 feet. Their pilots have been awake since 0300, drinking coffee thick enough to float a bullet, listening to the same briefing repeated in a dozen ready rooms. Today the Japanese are coming to die. Our job is to make it quick. 250 miles to the west, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launches everything he has left. 430 aircraft from 9 carriers. It is the largest single strike the Imperial Navy has mounted since Midway, and it is already doomed. 69 of the pilots have never landed on a carrier before. 47 have less than 6 months total flying time. Many have been told privately that fuel for a return trip is not guaranteed. They take off anyway because orders are still orders and because no one has yet found a way to live with the shame of refusing. At 9:57, the first Japanese formations appear on American radar. 4 massive blips crawling eastward at 180 knots. In the combat information centers, calm voices count them down the way farmers count clouds before a storm. Range 160 miles, 140, 120, contact. On the flight deck of USS Essex, Commander David McCampbell stands in his straps, goggles pushed up on his forehead, watching the horizon with the patience of a man who has already seen the ending. He is 34 years old, soft-spoken, the kind of officer who apologizes when he gives an order. Today, he will shoot down 7 Japanese aircraft before lunch. At 11:07, the sky tears open. The first wave, 69 fighters and bombers, flies straight into the layered Hellcat wall above the fleet. What happens next is not a battle, it is an extermination. Hellcats fall on the Japanese formations from above and behind, 650 calibers flashing in perfect synchronization. Zeros and Judies disintegrate in seconds. One Val pilot, realizing he will never reach the American carriers, rolls inverted and aims his burning bomber at the sea, rather than give the Americans the satisfaction of a kill. His wingman follows him down without firing a shot. Japanese radio frequencies collapse into a single, continuous scream. Veterans try to organize defensive circles and discover there are no longer enough experienced pilots to hold them together. Rookies fly straight and level because they have been told that weaving wastes fuel they do not have. They die straight and level. In 15 minutes, the first wave loses 41 aircraft. Only a handful drop their bombs, and those fall harmlessly into empty ocean. McCampbell finds a formation of 15 Zeros trying to climb above the carnage. He takes his division of 8 Hellcats straight through them at 350 knots, firing as he passes. 3 Zeros fall immediately. The rest scatter like startled birds. McCampbell reverses, climbs, and comes back down again. Another 4 are gone before the Japanese pilots even register that the same 4 Hellcats have returned. When the ammunition runs low, McCampbell and his wingman simply barrel through the remnants, tearing wings off with their propellers. In 22 minutes, he is credited with 7 kills, 5 Zeros and 2 Judies. His only comment on the radio is a quiet, almost embarrassed, splash 7. 40 miles south, Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu from VF-16 aboard USS Lexington finds himself alone against a formation of 6 Judies escorted by 8 Zeros. He attacks anyway. In 8 minutes, he shoots down 6 Judies in a single continuous firing pass, 1 every 80 seconds. When the last one burns into the sea, he still has ammunition left, so he turns toward the Zeros, shoots down 1 more for good measure, and then holds up 7 fingers to the rescue destroyer below. The crew cheers so loudly, they almost forget to fish the Japanese pilots out of the water. By 1400, 4 separate Japanese strikes have been annihilated. The final tally will be 240 aircraft destroyed in the air and another 50 on the burning Japanese carriers. American losses? 29 aircraft, most to fuel exhaustion on the long return in darkness. The pilots call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese never give it a name at all. In the ready room of the carrier Zuikaku, one of the few surviving flight leaders sits alone under a single bare bulb. His hands will not stop shaking. He is 23 years old and the senior pilot left alive in his squadron. Tomorrow he will be ordered to lead whatever is left against the American fleet again. He already knows what he will do when the Hellcats appear. He will not turn. He will not fight. He will simply close his eyes and push the stick forward until the ocean takes him. It is the only mercy still available. That night, in a quiet wardroom aboard USS Enterprise, David McCampbell pours coffee for a young ensign who has just landed with 41 bullet holes in his Hellcat and a 1,000-yard stare. The boy finally speaks. "Sir, they didn't even try. They just flew straight and waited for us to kill them." McCampbell looks at him for a long time, then nods once. That's what happens when an Air Force runs out of hope. In Tokyo, the news arrives in fragments, each one worse than the last. Admiral Ozawa signals, "Surviving strength insufficient for further combat." The Naval General Staff meets in silence, then issues the order that ends the myth of the Imperial Navy's air arm forever. From now on, aircraft will be used primarily for kamikaze attacks. Survival is no longer a consideration. The divine wind will replace skill, training, and fuel. It is the final admission that the Hellcat has done something no fleet battle ever could. It has broken the spirit of an entire generation of aviators. Post-war, the few Japanese aces who lived long enough to be interviewed spoke of the Hellcat with the same hushed tone men once reserved for earthquakes and typhoons. Saburo Sakai, blind in one eye and grounded in Japan, said simply, After 1944, we did not fight the Hellcat. We endured it. A kamikaze pilot who survived his mission because his engine failed wrote in 1956, "I was not afraid to die. I was afraid to die uselessly against those blue monsters that refused to fall." The Grumman F6F ended the war with 5,223 confirmed kills, more than any other aircraft in the Pacific, for the loss of 270 Hellcats in air combat. 19 of its pilots became aces in a single day. It never tried to be beautiful. It never needed to be. In hangars across America, the last Hellcats were pushed into storage in 1946. Their paint still bright, their engines still willing. No one held a ceremony. There was nothing left to prove. The Zero had ruled by agility and terror. The Hellcat ruled by certainty and survival. And when certainty meets terror, long enough, terror dies. In the Pacific sky, fear was the first weapon ever used. The Hellcat made sure it was the last. If you want more untold World War II stories, cockpit confessions, forgotten battles, the machines and men who actually decided the war, subscribe and join our community of history lovers. The sky still remembers.